Hello everyone! Today we're going to be doing something we haven't done for quite a while, and that is dunking on Owen Jones. Because he has decided to make one of the stupidest arguments you can make for anti-capitalism, or given I hate calling it capitalism, anti-free market, and that is the argument that the free market has lifted more people out of poverty than ever before. Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself by already saying that, yes, this is in fact true. I'd rather just riff off whatever Mr. Jones has to say. So, take it away, Owen.
This is the greatest lie about capitalism you will ever hear, and we're going to take it to pieces. And it is the idea that capitalism is the cure for poverty, that capitalism has lifted billions of humans out of abject squalor and poverty and insecurity, that as an engine of innovation and entrepreneurship, that in doing all of its magical things, it creates wealth which doesn't just end up in the pockets of the rich, but benefits all of us.
I mean, all you have to do is pull out this classic statistic, showing the percentage of the world that is in abject poverty, which I believe it uses the definition of being on under about $2 to live on a day. And as you can see, it's just a hockey stick graph. The late 20th century was the time we beat poverty, essentially. And not only that, but countries that allowed their people in poverty to work their way out of poverty, it didn't just stop at $2. Those countries tend to be the most successful as time goes on. Assuming it's not a place like Venezuela where they decided that property rights and the free market were bad things actually, and then put in successive governments that kept attacking free market property rights and nationalised every industry they could, and basically ended up putting most of their country back into poverty. The type of country that Owen Jones was singing the praises of but 5 years ago, and these days seems to be trying to not mention at all, but let's see if he mentions it in this video.
It's best summed up, or eloquently, I'd say, in the words of the Russian chess grandmaster Garry Kasparov: capitalism is the greatest destroyer of poverty in world history, and socialism its greatest creator, rivaling war.
So if I'm someone like Owen Jones who is trying their very best to try and say capitalism doesn't work and that alternative economic systems are better, the last thing I would do would be to try and quote someone who was born in the Soviet Union, lived through the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then from there left Russia not too long after to become a citizen of a neighbouring country that is a lot more free than Russia is, as the quote for the arguments that I am trying to argue against, because that's what Garry Kasparov did. He is a chess grandmaster, lived through the Soviet Union, lived through the collapse of it, and currently lives in Croatia. So he has lived both under capitalism, or free market economics, and socialist or communist economic systems as well. And from first-hand experience, as you can see, he clearly prefers the free market system, and through revealed preference of having lived through Russia all his life, deciding, rather live in a place that's quite a bit more free. And yes, he makes the point well here about 8 years ago, saying capitalism is the greatest way to lift people out of poverty. So I would love to know what Owen Jones has to say about this.
That's a claim you'll hear over and over again. Capitalism has rescued billions from poverty. Hallelujah.
Well, that's probably because it's true. How many capitalist countries can you name that have massive amounts of poverty?
Now, consider first the work of Jason Hickel. He's an economic anthropologist, and he wrote a really fascinating essay which really partly takes this to pieces, to be honest with you.
Damn, that's an article we've not been through on Laughing at the Guardian. That reminds me, I need to bring that back. Maybe I'll bring it back sometime soon for those of you that have been missing it. People have been asking me about it, and I think I'll bring it back. You, my audience, deserve it, but I have no doubt in my mind that that is going to be one of the silliest articles that I've ever read.
So, he notes this widely circulated graph showing the proportion of people living in poverty has fallen from 94% in 1820 to just 10% today.
Yeah, and that is absolutely nuts when you think about it. Throughout the whole of human history, throughout the tens of thousands of years that we have all lived, we have all been living effectively in abject poverty, bar the few lucky lords, ladies, kings and queens and all that. But then all of a sudden, the 20th century comes along, countries start realising that, oh, maybe we should be enforcing property rights and allowing for people to self-organise as they see fit, and all of a sudden, people start working and creating a lot more value than they used to, and in doing so, by creating all this wealth, they are able to lift themselves out of poverty. I mean, it just makes sense. And it is a miracle, really. We are living in very strange times, and thankfully, they are very, very, very good times.
Wow, incredible. Look what capitalism has done. No wonder it was shared by the likes of Bill Gates, showing the wonders of capitalism and showing why critics like myself are so wrong-headed.
It's such a shame that the most accurate and self-reflective comments that come from Owen Jones always turn out to be very sarcastic in tone.
Now, the first point Hickel made is that real data on poverty has only really been collected since 1981. So if you're going back before then, you're on pretty dodgy grounds.
I mean, this already is quite a funny argument. All that's really going to mean is that the error bars when you go back before 1981 are going to be larger than after 1981. That doesn't mean that poverty didn't exist before 1981.
It's not actually accurate data. You're not comparing like and like either.
You know, there's been arguments about Rishi Sunak saying that people should be learning maths till 18, and it's things like this that make me agree. Because people like Owen Jones will do all things they want with statistics to try and make his point rather than just reflect on what the evidence says and change his own mind from there. But then I think a bit more about it and I think, well, people have been learning maths up to 16 and that's really not helped this point anyway. So I don't think 2 extra years is going to help.
Because for much of history, much of humanity didn't use or depend on money. You had these subsistence economies where, you know, the things you relied on in order to live were available without cash. Land, forest, livestock, water, forest. But then colonization happened and it imposed a capitalist labour system. So from then on, people were forced from their lands into mines, plantations and factories owned by Europeans, and then they paid the people they colonized tiny amounts of money instead to live.
I mean, again, pretty silly argument, and it's an argument that has actually been taken into account by the people who create these statistics. Because Owen Jones isn't wrong when he says that not every society used cash ever, and instead would have been in tribes, hunting, gathering, farming, what have you. So what the statisticians did instead was say, okay, what do they have? Well, they have tools. What are they eating? Well, we can tell what their diets were. What were their shelters made out of? Oh, they were made out of twigs and mud. And what they did from that was they could actually tell how many assets these people had, and therefore they could make a reasonable estimate on how much they were living on a day. Surprise, surprise, when you have pre-industrial farms living in what are essentially, at best, log cabins, then you are considered to be living in poverty, because anything goes wrong on that farm, you're starving. But I do also enjoy Owen Jones's assertion that it was a capitalist system that we brought over during colonisation. During the early days of colonisation, we actually had a system called mercantilism, where essentially you had an aristocracy of merchants going out and trying to make business ventures in the colonies. And they were essentially decentralised arms of the British state. And while Owen Jones is trying to say they forced the locals to work in mines and things like this, it wasn't really true, and you can tell this throughout America, in that Indian wars only really started happening after the days of the Wild West, where property rights and deals were made by, you know, cattle ranchers and things like that with local Indians to say, right, this is your land, do what you want with it, we're just going to stick to our land, and we're going to have deals where we can. It's when the US government got involved where things got pretty bad. And also with ex-colonies that kept mostly British parliamentary systems and didn't have ridiculous revolutions, you will find that these places actually tend to be doing best out of all the ex-colonies. For example, go look at Botswana in Africa. Seems to be doing pretty well without a revolution.
That isn't a key element, though. That is an important element, I would say. But the trend that the graph showing how poverty is being crushed by capitalism is based on a poverty line of $1.90 a day. That's, I'm trying to think what that is in pounds, but you get the impression. $1.90 a day. The equivalent of what $1.90 could buy in the US, this graph back in 2011, it's obscenely low by any standards, as he says.
Well, yes, that's why it says extreme poverty. And I'm also going to go out on a limb and assume that he is not going to mention that this is generally a well-accepted definition of extreme poverty from the UN. Because yes, prices may be high in the US, but if you look abroad, you have to ask, well, how much is a loaf of bread worth in other countries? And you'll find that it is worth very little. Just numbers I'm quickly Googling off the top of my head. Apparently a loaf of white bread in the US is worth $2.50, and in Zimbabwe it's worth less than $1. But again, I'm making a counter-argument before they've actually made the argument. Let's hear what they've got to say.
He says we now have piles of evidence that people living just above this line have terrible levels of malnutrition and mortality. Earning $2 per day doesn't mean that you're somehow suddenly free of extreme poverty. Not by a long shot, of course. Spot on.
Yeah, but as I mentioned before, no one's making that argument. And again, it doesn't just stop when you go over $2. People will pull themselves over that $2 threshold and then keep going. No one is saying that as soon as they are over $2, we should stop helping them however they can, or they will stop helping themselves however they can.
Which is why, as Jason Hickel noted, scholars were arguing for a more reasonable poverty line for years, and a minimum of $7.40 a day for basic nutrition and normal human life.
Well, define it however you want. You will see similar graphs. You'll just see a larger red area, but you'll keep seeing that people are pulling themselves out of poverty more and more. That's why poverty had to be completely redefined in the UK by Blair's government, because they couldn't keep saying people are in poverty, because it just wasn't true. So they had to come up with a relative poverty line, which basically just means, are you on 60% of the median wage or below it? Which, by the way, just for reference, for the UK, that would be just under $60 a day.
I mean, even that is pushing it, let's be honest with you.
Yeah, being in poverty sucks. Being just above poverty also sucks, but is a lot better than being in poverty. Again, no one is saying that we need to stop helping people who are just above the poverty line. What we are saying is that if people are allowed to help themselves, then generally they will, especially to get out of awful situations. The free market allows them to do that, it just requires that they work for it.
But others, for example, suggest, the Harvard economist Lance Pritchard, that the poverty line should be set even higher at $10 to $15 a day. I mean, even then, look, let's be honest, we're talking about ridiculously low sums of money.
I mean, I do love it. There are people saying that the poverty line should be above minimum wage. From the sounds of it, Owen Jones won't be happy until the poverty line is the median wage. And even then he'd probably still be unhappy, because there are still billionaires and millionaires about. Effectively, what Owen Jones wants here is for poverty to be redefined as low income, when really what poverty means is that you are on so low income you are barely able to live. And I don't mean live as in have a comfortable life, I mean live as in can't even afford food, let alone deciding whether that money should go towards heating or food.
But if we're going to just, as Jason Hickel said, let's be flexible about this. Let's go for $7.40 per day, just to be, not. I mean, that's an obscenely low amount of money.
It's only just under minimum wage. And again, this is defining it worldwide. He's not taking into account as to what costs are in these countries where poverty is rife. In other words, he's looking at this problem through a lens of having only ever lived and know about issues in Britain. So he sees cost of living crisis and then people move into poverty. Well, again, that's people moving below this relative poverty line. That does not mean people in the United Kingdom are starving. But what $7.40 could mean for someone below the poverty line in a country where poverty is rife could mean that they can finally get themselves and their family out of a cycle of malnutrition. And that is assuming that they are not already getting help from international charities to stop them from suffering from malnutrition. But unfortunately, it's never going to be perfect. Look, if the poverty issue was just about money, we'd have solved it already. It's not just about money.
Some would argue we should set it higher, but let's just go for that, he says. And then he says, the number of people living under this line increased dramatically since measurements began in 1981, reaching 4.2 billion people when he wrote this article in 29. I'm sure it's even greater today.
Now, I'm something of a Guardian expert here, especially on their opinion pieces, and this does come from an opinion piece. Now, Owen Jones has just read out this paragraph verbatim, essentially. And as you can see, when it comes to The Guardian, if something is highlighted in orange, that means it is going to link you to something. As you can see, the only link in this paragraph is the word Davos, and all that does is take you to another Guardian page with the tag Davos, and it takes you to any article with the tag Davos in. In other words, this claim appears to have come out of nowhere. I don't know what he is basing this on, I don't know what research has been put into this, but either way it's silly anyway, because it doesn't matter where you put this poverty line, everyone's income, especially the poor's by the way, has increased drastically. Meaning, yes, you probably will see more people under this line than if the line's lower, that goes without saying, but you will also see a similar trend in that since 1981, more people have come out of poverty and come above this line than before. The trend is the same.
And the point he makes is all the gains have virtually happened in one place, China. So it's disingenuous to say, well, that's neoliberalism. We'll talk about China shortly, because that's not free market capitalism by any stretch.
No, but I bet you'll find that most people are lifted out of poverty in their special economic zones.
And he said if you take China out of the equation, then it looks even worse, because over the 4 decades since 1981, the number of people in poverty has gone up, but the percentage has remained stagnant at 60%.
Again, as you can see from the article, there is absolutely no link to substantiate this. I have no idea where those numbers have come from. I don't know the methodology. I don't know why he'd even claim this, because even if it was just China, just have a look at extreme poverty in India. From 1981, it's gone from over 50% to just over 10%. And yes, I know that is using the $1.90 threshold, but as I went through before, it doesn't really matter where you put this line. It doesn't just stop when it gets to $1.90. But I'm not even going to do the maths for this. I just know that percentage is way out of whack. There are over 1 billion people in India. If just over 10% of them are in poverty in 2017, so it's probably less now, then that would already account for just under an eighth of the world being out of poverty. It's just a nonsense claim to try and say that over 60% of the world's in poverty. It's just obviously not true.
Now, we could go on. Let's keep looking at the facts and the evidence under this.
There has been literally none in this article. This did turn into laughing at the Guardian, as it turned out. But this article has literally added nothing to the conversation. Because Jason Hickel apparently needed to do maths till he was 18.
So, the Our World in Data series, which you might look it up online, loads of useful graphs, very, very useful. And according to that, just 15% of humans earn poor. The other 85% earn less than $30 a day. So it's very important to just note just how difficult the lives are of the vast majority of humanity.
Once again, Owen Jones is being a bit of an idiot. I've just had a quick scan through of the Our World in Data article that he is reading from, The Global Poverty in an Unequal World, Who is Considered Poor in a Rich Country, and what does this mean for our understanding of global poverty? And this is what the abstract says. The extremely low poverty line that the UN relies on has the advantage that it draws the attention to the very poorest people in the world. It has the disadvantage that it ignores what is happening to the income of 90% of the world's population who live above the extreme poverty threshold. The global poverty line that the UN relies on is based on the national poverty lines in the world's poorest countries. In this article, I ask what global poverty looks like if it were to rely on the notions of poverty that are common in the world's rich countries like Denmark, the US or Germany. Based on evidence, I ask what our aspirations for the future of global poverty reduction might be. Just to put that in other words, and to make Owen Jones seem like even more of a fool, what that abstract is essentially saying is we have done so well at eradicating poverty that we now need to address people's needs from the perspective of rich countries. In other words, people aren't in poverty, people aren't starving, but we need to look at how we can make people's lives better by allowing them to have better incomes, or helping them get better incomes. That is completely different to addressing poverty. That is addressing people at the bottom of the income distribution and helping them up the ladder to higher incomes. That is a completely different question as to how we address poverty. This is different to Owen Jones's insinuation, and I do love as well how this article will actually refer to that $30 line as a poverty line, and he doesn't want to do that. He just wants to say, poor and not poor. And again, this article isn't even saying that living under $30 is difficult. All it's really saying is that it looks like we'd have a bigger problem if we had a higher poverty line. No duh.
Now, as Jacobin magazine points out, the commonly used cutoff of $1.90 a day only comes to $694 a year. That represents 6% of the US federal poverty line.
Yes, and again, you're not asking why is that the poverty line when it comes to the UN. And if you did any amount of reading, you would have found out that the reason is because it is based on a threshold of each nation individually, what that purchasing power is in that country relative to the US dollar, and that's about what income rate people can get themselves out of poverty. That is all that line means. And it doesn't even necessarily mean if you are on $2 a day you can get out of poverty. You're trying to judge a very individual problem that is poverty, and you're trying to apply it to 8 billion people. Of course it's going to be difficult, and of course it's not going to be completely accurate. And of course poverty in a very poor country is going to be defined differently to poverty in a very rich country. The reason rich countries had to do that is because they solved poverty. For example, if you read Road to Wigan Pier by, I nearly said Enoch Powell, his name's George Orwell, but if you read Road to Wigan Pier, you will see absolutely nowhere in the UK that reflects the poverty that George Orwell wrote about. They will have immeasurably better living standards than the people who had to crouch down in very narrow coal mines to get coal out for a pittance a day. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't people in the UK who need help, and we shouldn't help anyone in the UK whatsoever. That is saying we've done a pretty damn good job of solving the issue.
So they look at 2009 to 2019, where the global personal income pie grew by $37 trillion. That is a lot of money. So that's people's personal income globally. But of that, the top decile took 8.7 trillion. That's 24%. Whilst the bottom deciles got $25 billion, 0.07%.
Once again, no dirt. This is what the free market does. What he's not realising is that a lot of these places that will have the very rich will be places where the free market has been allowed to flourish. And the reason they're making money isn't because they're stealing it from the poor like he's trying to insinuate. It's because they have invested it sensibly and managed to make things that allow people to trade their own money and their own income for the goods and services they have created. Now, of course, you do have government interference in all this and all that, but I'm not convinced that's where the vast majority of the wealth for these people comes from. I think people are giving them money in fact, we can prove that they're giving them money voluntarily for their goods and services. Bear in mind this was pre-pandemic, so Bezos was still a billionaire before then, and he made a very good company. It just happened that lockdown rules benefited him massively.
So the poor got 0.07%, 345 times less than the rich of that income in between 2009 and 2019. So growth was being sucked into the pockets of those at the very top, not those who are poor.
See what I mean by this insinuation of it was the rich hoovering up all the wealth? He just doesn't understand that to create wealth, you have to actually do something productive that has value. You won't just get things because you're poor. And having said that, billionaires do a insane amount of philanthropy work. They give billions to charities. It's just a shame that a lot of them turn out to be Ponzi schemes.
Now, the other key point to make is that when we talk about the improvements in people's living standards, they're often based on struggles against capitalism. So if we think, for example, of wages going up, well, in large part, that is throughout history, trade unions organising collectively in order to raise the wages of those that they represent.
I mean, this is the strange mind of Owen Jones. He thinks that wages have only ever increased when trade unions have existed. And I mean, all you have to do is point at the time Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister, where she fought the trade unions and effectively pacified them. You'd think with that you'd see a fall in wages, and in fact throughout the 80s all you see is a rise in wages. So it doesn't make sense.
And studies, for example, in the United States shows that is a impact not just on unionised workers, but they drive up the wages also of non-unionised workers.
Well, yeah, if unions force the rate up, of course non-union workers are going to see the benefit of that. But it only ever seems to be unions that are unionised against the government that seem to actually strike or anything like that, especially these days. There are plenty of unions in the UK that aren't unionised against the government, such as unions for people who work in supermarkets, and they never go on strike. And the reason is because it's a market, so it's setting it at market rate. And if it's at market rate, then the businesses and most of the people who work for them are happy. Whereas now in the UK, you're seeing junior doctors striking for days on end for 35% pay rise. Because, quite frankly, they're just trying to be cheeky about it.
There's the other point that often social democratic parties came to power and they imposed constraints on capitalism. They rolled back the frontiers of capitalism in the sense they set up publicly funded and run welfare states, public services like education and public health, and redistributive taxation systems. So all of them obviously wasn't about capitalism just doing its thing and creating wealth, but social democratic parties putting checks on the power of capitalism in order to raise the living standards of those that they represented.
Yeah, and quite a lot of the time they found out, we're putting too many regulations in this market. Oh, we're making our welfare states a bit too big. I mean, this is exactly what happened in the Scandinavian countries, and they had to go through a phase of austerity to try and correct it. And of course, if you don't try and correct that when you're trying to, in a very nice way, if we're referencing Venezuela, put restrictions on capitalism, or in their case, just outright taking over the companies by force, then you find that you end up just putting a load of people in poverty again. So it's not as simple as centre-left parties get in power and everything's okay. I mean, that was happening in the UK ever since World War II, essentially, and then we needed Margaret Thatcher to come in and correct that.
Going further, if we look, for example, about those who've enacted free market capitalism as a policy, so Latin America really was the testing ground for neoliberalism, as we call it. The rolling back of the state, privatisation, deregulation, slashing taxes on the rich, and so on.
I will bet money at this point. I don't think he's going to bring up Venezuela, even though he's brought up Latin America. I cannot wait to see how he tries to square this circle.
Now, what happened in Latin America in the 1980s when this was absolutely rampant? In 1980, 40.5% of Latin America lived below the poverty line. By 1990, it had risen to 48.3%.
Right, go on. Please explain to me how this is capitalism's fault.
So you've got a dramatic increase. Even by 2002, it hadn't got back to where it was in 1980. But since then, you've got a range of governments throughout Latin America which have enacted mass social reforms, rolled back free market capitalism, and as a consequence, poverty on the eve of the pandemic fell to about 28%.
I mean, there's such a massive problem with just generalising it as Latin America. Because again, if we go to specific examples, Venezuela, yes, as I assume was quite typical for Latin America, you probably had a load of American venture capitalists come in, invest a load of money, make the money, and then export it, while paying people, well, the market rate for inside their countries. If you do what Venezuela did and say, don't allow any sort of foreign trade in the country, and then take over all the industries as they start saying, hey, what you're doing isn't good, you end up with a load more people in poverty. However, you follow the route of Chile during Pinochet and even post-Pinochet, after he stopped being a dictator. He freed up the markets. He allowed international trade. And what happens? Well, poverty in Chile tended to go down, and it went down a lot quicker than other Latin American countries. But I do love how worldwide more and more countries have been going more free market and forcing property rights and things like that, and we've seen poverty rates plummet. And then Owen Jones comes in with this one exception he thinks he's found, and then you look slightly closer at all the statistics and it turns out, oh no, the ones that are more capitalist were actually the ones helping the poverty rate a lot more.
So you've got dramatic falls in poverty, not because of free market capitalism, but because of governments that rejected free market capitalism.
Now again, this is a really poor way of phrasing it. So social democrats generally actually do see the benefits of the free market economy. It wasn't a rejection of the free market economy. It was that they're trying to strike a balance of getting as much wealth redistributed as possible while still allowing people to be prosperous and actually pay for all the things they want to do. Unfortunately, this probably isn't actually the most economically sound way to run a country. But this is the old classic socialists are trying to claim Norway and the rest of the Scandinavian countries as their own. Except now he's trying to do it with Latin America, but for some reason he's not mentioning Venezuela specifically, even though years ago he was saying this is the perfect country to show that my system can work. Surprise, surprise, it completely collapsed, and he's just not mentioning it again.
Now, this point about China is a really important one, because China is an unpleasant dictatorship, which is not something any of us should wish to emulate.
Unless, of course, you're Ash Sarkar.
But if we're looking at poverty reduction there, we'd have to note that that is a state-managed economy in lots of basic ways.
Right, yes, it is a horrible dictatorship. Yes, they do still call themselves communist. However, and I really hope this does happen, but in the 1990s, China starts having to liberalise a lot of their markets, especially their financial markets, effectively because of Tiananmen Square, because people got fed up with the way the communist government were running things, and they wanted more freedom and they wanted more prosperity. What Owen Jones is about to say is probably that poverty started increasing throughout the 1990s, despite the fact it's a state-run economy, which overwhelmingly it is. But when they started getting a few free market zones in there, you'll probably see that poverty started reducing a lot quicker.
That you have, if you like, the key commanding heights of the economy under state ownership, like finance. You've got 150,000 state-owned Chinese enterprises. Of the 117 mainland Chinese companies which make it into the top 500 list of global companies, 91 are owned by the state.
So instead, it's the people of the Communist Party making the billions rather than private people who are putting all the work in.
Public assets are worth 150% of the country's gross domestic economy.
I want to know what he's reading off here, because I think he read that wrong. How can state-owned assets be worth more than the GDP? How can it be 150% of the GDP? I've tried Googling that statistic, like verbatim for what he said. I can't find anything that's even close to that number. The most I'm finding is that state-owned enterprises account for 60% of China's economy. Which actually, now that I think about it, that the UK is actually pretty close to that. So Owen Jones should be absolutely laughing. We're basically in his communist utopia,
compared to less than 50% in almost all major capitalist economies.
Yes, and thank God for that, because if everything was state-owned, it would just be atrocious. That's why we moved away from it after the war. A lot of industry was straight-owned straight after World War II, and it caused a lot of problems. Because we're an island that like our trade, and we like it to be free.
So basically, you can't look at that and go, well, that's free market capitalism doing its thing.
No, but yet again, I'm still waiting for you to let me know when poverty started dropping, because again, if it happened in the 90s, that is the liberalising and free market forces that are driving that. If you move towards a free market and you get less poverty, it's fair to say there's a correlation there.
Again, you're having constraints put on capitalism rather than just capitalism red in tooth and clawed doing its thing.
Again, Owen Jones being a bit disingenuous here. Apart from the anarcho-capitalists who even I think are mental, no one's really for capitalism without any sort of law to govern it. Even the most ardent free marketeers are okay with some basic regulations. You'd be quite hard-pressed to find any that think it's okay for, say, food standards to be ignored, or for waste to not be properly managed or something like that. But Owen Jones here is saying, well, if you have any sort of government doing anything, that's not the free market. And that's not really how this works, because this whole thing's on a scale. And pretty much every successful country is certainly towards the free market end of that scale. Bar an exception like China, but that is quite reliant on international markets to work, so, you know.
The other point is, if we look at capitalism creating all these ideas and innovation that take on poverty, as the work of Professor Mariana Mazzucato points out, much of what those innovations are actually created by public sector research. So take this iPhone, for example. The voice-activated Siri, innovation created by the Defence Advanced Research Projects Agency, the publicly run agency for developing military. The GPS, again, used for those of us who get lost while we're travelling around major cities, created by the US Department of Defense. The invention of LCD technology, funded by the US Army and DARPA again. Touchscreen technology made possible by research at the publicly funded University of Delaware with grants from the public sector, National Science Foundation, and the CIA. The internet itself was a spin-off of a DARPA-funded project. The creation of the Google algorithm was funded by the National Science Foundation. The arrival of the silicon chip depended on public sector research and development. We could go on.
So I let him list all those off to make a couple of points. Firstly, when he was going on about innovations made in the military, well, the whole idea of the free market is that competition is the driver for innovation. And when you're in a military, your competition is other militaries. You are trying to outmaneuver your enemy via technology. This is why radio was invented during World War II. This is why jet engines and rockets came out of World War II. This is why you have loads of innovations during major wars. Because you have problem. Enemy has big guns. What's your reaction? Make defences for said guns. That comes in terms of technology. And again, he's going on about all these inventions that were brought about by either public funding, which there's private funding in there as well, but let's not get into that. But also that he's missing the second part of this, which is, yeah, you can make as much useless stuff you want with public money. The main thing is, with private markets, they will cut the wheat from the chaff. They will say, here is a new invention, how do I make that valuable enough to other people that the price of it outweighs the cost and I get a profit? That is where it comes in. That is why in Britain, for example, when it comes to the internet, there is no publicly provided internet service provider. They're all private. And they're all pretty cheap, and the infrastructure is really good throughout the UK. It's a really well-connected country when it comes to broadband. So yeah, no one has ever made the argument that the public sector cannot make any innovations and cannot come up with new inventions full stop. The argument is that the free market is the best way to determine the wheat from the chaff, the good innovations, the useful innovations from the poor inventions that are of no use to anyone. Whereas if it's all publicly funded and there's no market mechanism, we don't know which is which, and it's up to whoever's in charge to decide what is useful and not, when it might not be particularly useful to anyone.
This phone is full of things which were created by public sector research.
And was developed and made useful for the average person like you, Owen Jones, through entrepreneurship, innovation in the private sector, and bringing it all together to put it in that phone that you are waving about as if public money made it.
This idea that capitalism is out there through innovation and entrepreneurship as the, creating this vast amounts of wealth. Well, the evidence doesn't stack up.
The evidence you have presented throughout most of this doesn't actually go anywhere. You had a Guardian opinion piece that didn't link to any substantial research. And then the rest of the things that you did read off directly from official research didn't actually say what you think it said. And don't actually refute what the main point is, which is that the free market is more effective at allocating resources than centrally controlled markets or economies. That is not to say centrally controlled ones can't be effective, but if we look at any sort of history, and if you are honest about, say, Venezuela, you should be able to admit that, yes, when that goes wrong, it goes very wrong. And when it goes wrong here in the UK, people just have to give up Netflix for a bit. I know I'd much rather be saying, yes, I will give up Netflix for a few months than saying, am I going to eat my pet rabbit today? Because that's what happened in Venezuela.
That so much of our progress is done because of public sector research, but also the improvements in living standards, partly down to technological progress, but also partly down to people struggling against capitalism.
One example was some trade unions. If you're going to do a fair test and compare a bunch of trade unions in one specific time in the US, then let's do the same thing and look at Henry Ford. Oh, his wages were way higher than everyone else's. Oh, he made cars really, really cheaply and brought in the automobile revolution in the US. He completely innovated the way businesses are managed. It is so revolutionary what Henry Ford managed to do that Aldous Huxley made it the basis for Brave New World and made Henry Ford a god. And he didn't need any trade unions to make a 5-day week, to allow his workers to have good holidays, to give them a good wage or anything like that, on-the-job training as well. He didn't need state involved for any of that, and he improved an immeasurable amount of people's lives. It's just a shame now that the car industry is so regulated that now all cars are pretty much looking the same, and there are only 2 car companies in the US, effectively, that are still going, and one of them happens to be Ford, because the industry has been regulated to a point where it's just not allowed to change.
And indeed, if we look at a more reasonable definition of poverty, then you haven't had the massive reductions in poverty that have been claimed, and where you have it in a country which in no way can be presented as an icon of free market capitalism.
I love it. China caught up and only managed to catch up. I mean, I love how he doesn't actually give the years where poverty improved. He just makes a vague claim that China improved their poverty standings. But then when it comes to absolutely every Western country, or even Chile, which is a free market economy, or was, I should say, you'll see that poverty does indeed just seem to nosedive over a few decades. And this is why, as Owen Jones constantly goes on about, poverty has had to be redefined in all these countries because it's been solved. Now we just need to fix the last 10%, and then, yeah, maybe we can look at raising the poverty line and looking to fix all the other issues there. But at the moment, I'd rather sort out the malnourished people rather than worry if people in Greece can afford Netflix.
This is all based on a myth, a lie, a con, and I think it needs to be exposed even further.
Well, Jonesy, you did absolutely nothing to refute capitalism whatsoever. All you did was prove that there were a few exceptions, and you didn't look into detail in these exceptions and find out that actually moving towards a slightly more free market system did help all these countries. And of course, when you ignore all the countries you have cheerleaded for in the past for being these social democracies, this 21st century socialism, then of course you can constantly keep trying to regurgitate this nonsense, but I'm not having any of it. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. So, as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.